morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us today for this Comprehensive Energy Plan and Climate Council Building Sector, Thermal Sector Workshop. We're really excited that you all could join us today and help us and provide input to these really important energy and climate issues that we'll be talking about today. If you could go to the next slide, Kelly. My name is TJ Poor. I am the Director of Efficiency and Energy Resources at the Public Service Department. Public Service Department is both the State Energy Office and the Ratepayer Advocate in Vermont. And we have the responsibility of crafting the state's comprehensive energy plan. Co-hosting with us today are Dave Farnsworth, the Regulatory Assistance Project, and Christine Donovan, who has her own consulting business that they are both members of the Vermont Climate Council Cross-Sector Mitigation Subcommittee and the task leads for the building sectors and coming up with building thermal energy policy actions to mitigate climate change. I also like to introduce today a facilitator for the workshop. That's Cindy Cook of Adamant Accord. And we don't have time today. We have a pretty full agenda. We don't have time for everybody to introduce yourself, but if you could please just do that in the chat with your name and organization. Just pop that into the chat. It would be helpful for everybody to see who's here and for the record in perpetuity. If you can go to the next slide, and then I'm going to plan and the climate action plan. We really need to hear from industry stakeholders, many of you who we directly invited, and interested stakeholders who have the time and energy to and expertise that we may not know about, who thank you for coming today. And we need to hear about the policies and programs that are in place or that should be in place to help us meet our energy needs. This workshop is one of 3 workshops that are led by the department in the Comprehensive Energy Plan. There's a lot more stakeholder engagement that the Climate Council is leading that the department will be in support of. This is the second one of 3. We had the electric sector last week and transportation next week. Specifically today, as you go through, there'll be a number of presentations for the first hour or so. And then really there's going to be the bulk of the time for discussion and input. And as you go through, we want to keep these objectives in mind. Really, how should we consider competing priorities and trade-offs when assessing policy options? And what are the decision-making criteria? And how should those criteria be employed? And then really what strategies and policy and programs are needed to get us where we need to go to meet the GWSA and Climate Action Plan requirements and the Comprehensive Energy Plan goals and just broader Vermont energy policy. Next slide, please, Kelly. So I'm going to turn it over to Cindy Cook to go over the agenda and some logistics for the meeting today.
TJ, this is Philip. I don't think Cindy has joined us. She's in the process of logging on, so you may want to run through those.
Yeah, I can do that. She was having some technical difficulties this morning, and I thought she had gotten on, but I guess not. So I was hopefully this was going to be a space where you didn't hear me talk for a minute, but the agenda for today, again, we'll go with kind of just the welcome introductions. We're gonna, I mentioned we're gonna talk for a little bit of the first hour here, just to kind of do some context setting. We'll provide an overview of the energy plan, the action plan development process, and the Global Warming Solutions Act coordinator, Marion Waltz, is here to help us with that. I'll go over a state of the state, where we are now and the programs that are available and kind of some thermal energy stats in the building sector. And Sarah Phillips will be here joining us to talk about equity in the building sector, and we'll have some space, plenty of space, hopefully, for discussion. Following that, we'll just set some more context around decision-making frameworks that I was just talking about, and then introduce the Climate Action Plan draft policies that the Cross-Sector Mitigation Committee has worked on. And then the part that I'm most excited about is the breakouts. So after a short break, we'll have some breakouts where we have questions that were teed up in the agenda. Please, in the broader agenda that was sent out on the website, please take a look at those. We'll have the questions up and facilitated discussions there to really get in-depth input into each of these, each sector. We'll do that for an hour, report from the breakouts, and then talk about some of the cross-cutting themes that are coming to bear. And then as we'll do some wrap up. So it should be a full 4 hours, and we're really looking forward to it. Next slide, please. So all of us should be pretty used to Zoom by now, and attending meetings here. We have posted some specific meeting etiquette guidelines. These are the same for those of you who have been involved with the Climate Council. They're the same etiquette guidelines that are there. During the presentations and when you're not talking, please remain muted. When it is your turn to speak during discussion, we welcome seeing your face and having video. The workshop is being recorded and will be posted to the Energy Plan website after the event. And there's going to be several opportunities to ask questions or provide comments. You can either use the raise your hand function, which is, it's a little different on everybody's computer. On mine, it's in the reactions box on the bottom of the screen to raise hand. I don't believe anybody is in person here in the Giga room. But if you're on the phone, you can press *6 to unmute during the Q&A and ask your question there. And we just want to be respectful of providing opportunity for lots of people to speak here and get input from a broad range of folks. So please, try it gets hard with some of these complex issues that we'll be talking about, but try and keep your remarks concise and clear. And after the workshop, we'll talk about, I think the last slide of this deck is opportunities for future input. And so this is not the only opportunity to contribute. Next slide. Oh, thank you. I think we'll dive right in, and this is great because we've covered some of the logistics more quickly than we had in the agenda. So we can dive right in, and this will help give us more time for discussion. And where we're going to head now is just to give an overview of the Comprehensive Energy Plan and the Climate Action Plan, kind of set the stage where we're at in the process here. And I'll start with the energy plan. So as the department contemplates developing the Comprehensive Energy Plan, we're really guided by Vermont energy policy, which is embodied in Title 30, Section 202A. And I won't read this to everybody, but it is really the foundation of our thinking. And it's to meet our energy needs. There's some words bolded in bold print there. Sustainably, reliably, affordably, meeting our greenhouse gas reduction requirements cost effectively. All of these things, it'll get to the trade-off theme I was talking about, but they don't always align. And so sometimes there's trade-offs between those, and help really in your thoughts and where to emphasize as we go forward will be really, really helpful. But next slide, please. So the comprehensive energy plan itself is really two plans. It used to be the electric plan on the right-hand side there is its own plan and a 20-year assessment of the electric demand and supply and strategies to meet this energy needs. We also have the comprehensive 20-year analysis and projections of the use, supply, cost, and environmental effects of all energy sources in Vermont. And so we put it forward within one plan because really the sectors are not so siloed, and we do the comprehensive energy plan every 6 years, at least every 6 years, and our due date is in January. Next slide, please. There's a couple of other specific requirements in the comprehensive energy plan. One is that it needs to include standards and recommendations for Act 174 enhanced energy planning. That's really the planning that regional planning commissions and municipalities do to meet their own energy needs. And when they submit and have their plans approved, they actually get substantial deference in citing before the Public Utility Commission. So in cases in citing, they can really help guide the types of resources they want in their communities. Also, the energy plan, I'll talk a little bit more about this, but it has to be consistent with the greenhouse gas reduction requirements in the Global Warming Solutions Act, and has to be consistent with the Climate Action Plan, and also relevant goals of Title 24, and those are land use planning goals. So every 6 years, we're due this coming January 2016 was our last energy plan. I think a lot of you are probably familiar with that. 90% renewable by 2050 was the vision that was really carried forward from the previous plan. That plan also had over 300 different recommendations in it for different actions. So we had vision and we had action in the Comprehensive Energy Plan 2016. So for this version, where's our starting point? We're starting with 90% renewable by 2050. We're not changing that, and we're starting with the requirements of the Global Warming Solutions Act, which have certain emissions requirements that are based on the greenhouse gas inventory that's developed by the Agency of Natural Resources. There's one more not listed there, I should note, is that there's a requirement for to be net zero by 2050 also in the Global Warming Solutions Act. Next slide. So with those starting points, our vision for the 2022 Comprehensive Energy Plan is to focus on a strategic plan that really identifies the trade-offs among policies. So I mentioned the last plan had the high-level vision and also the over 300 actions, but there was not a clear strategy to get from the vision to the actions. And so we really are hoping that this 2022 Comprehensive Energy Plan can be a strategic plan that guides us and articulates a decision-making framework that talks about the trade-offs among policies, that identifies milestones where we can say we've had a success and we can shift our emphasis, or we need to put more resources in this area, and really identify uncertainties that could also affect the policy success. We want the plan to be robust in the face of uncertainty. For instance, if there's a global pandemic and we are all doing stakeholder input via Zoom. And I mentioned some of the other pieces that the energy plan will include. The one that I haven't mentioned yet is the state agency energy plan. That is the state's lead by example plan. Next slide, please. So in service of the energy plan, we're doing some modeling. Folks may remember last time around we did what was called then a total energy study. we're doing some similar modeling here, some pathways modeling and scenario analysis, working with Agency of Natural Resources, NESCOM, who's the Regional Association of Air Regulators, the Stockholm Environment Institute, who developed the Low Emissions Analysis Platform, LEAP. And we've developed a business as usual reference case, and we're developing mitigation pathways to really test ways to meet our targets. We're doing this in coordination with the Climate Council. The LEAP modeling initial results have been presented to a couple of subcommittees, and working closely with certain council members to actually provide input as we go. What we don't want is to have two different sets of modeling for the energy plan and the climate action plan. That would be inefficient and confusing. So we're having one set of modeling, and really what LEAP is an accounting model. So we can estimate what the impact of our policies are in terms of weatherization or alternative fuels, and see what the impacts will be to energy use, what the impacts will be to emissions and to cost. The other note is that once the plan is done, we do plan to try to regionalize the LEAP model. And one of the good things about it is that the department and the Agency of Natural Resources will have licenses to the model and training on the model to use this going forward. And we can regionalize it so that municipalities, regional planning commissions we can provide assistance. We can't do it. We don't have the resources to do it for them, but we can provide assistance to their energy planning needs using the LEAP model. So the timeline, right now we are in August, where we're doing these topical stakeholder meetings. We did have some regional forums that were coordinated with the regional planning commissions in June that were really informative as well. Through the rest of August and really into September, now we will finish initial modeling, and we plan to, after this stakeholder input and coordinated input with the Climate Council, publish a draft of the energy plan in October. We'll have written comments and public hearings. Written comments there are October through November, but it really will take them any time. And then a provisionally adopted energy plan published in January of 2022. Reason that it says provisionally adopted is really because the Climate Council is having their initial climate action plan in December, but is resourced and going to do a really broad stakeholder outreach process. They're doing it now, but also once the draft climate action plan is complete, and the department and the energy plan are going to join and support that process too, as well. And in the spring of 2022, we'll update the energy plan as necessary, given that feedback. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over now to Marion Moltz, the Global Warming Solutions Act coordinator, to talk about the climate action plan.
Great. Thanks, TJ. Good morning, everyone. Thanks, TJ, for the introduction. My name is Marion Moltz. I'm the Global Warming Solutions Act coordinator with the Agency of Natural Resources, working to support the Climate Council that was established through the Global Warming Solutions Act. So I'm going to, I know we are limited on time here. I'm going to pack in a lot of information, making the assumption that some folks on the phone may not be very familiar with the Global Warming Solutions Act, but encourage everyone to check out the Agency of Administration website for the Climate Council that has a dearth of resources around the Global Warming Solutions Act and the work that's happened thus far. So the Global Warming Solutions Act was passed last fall, and the administration had 30 days from receiving those appointments to convene the first meeting of the council. So the council started meeting in October of 2020. The Global Warming Solutions Act stood up a climate council, which is made up of 15 legislative appointments from the House and the Senate and 8 administrative officials. And the climate council is charged with writing and developing and adopting a climate action plan by December 1st. This plan will be updated, revised and updated once every 4 years. And the interesting and exciting thing about this first climate action plan is that it's tied with the comprehensive energy plan. Moving forward, that process being tied with the comprehensive energy plan is going to happen once every 12 years. So that's why, as TJ identified in his presentation, we're working really hard to ensure these plans and the requirements and the work speak closely to each other throughout the plan writing and the public engagement process. Next slide, please. So jumping right into sort of the sequence of work that's happened thus far and what's ahead of us. The Climate Council is made up of a steering committee whose job it is to advance the work of the full council outside of their monthly meetings. This fall, so starting in September, we will be shifting to Climate Council and steering committee meetings bi-weekly, so twice a month, as we move towards implementation and adoption of actions for the climate action plan. So work is really picking up here with the steering committee and the subcommittees. We have 4 subcommittees that were defined in statute, and the council was given the discretion to add any additional subcommittees that may be needed to advance the work and development of the climate action plan. So I'll run through those subcommittees for you all here. The first you'll see is the Rural Resilience and Adaptation Subcommittee, and they are working in service to develop resilience and adaptation strategies for rural communities, really with an emphasis on the impacts that climate change and adaptation will pose on rural communities. There's the Agriculture and Ecosystem Subcommittee, which is focused on sequestration and resilience in natural and working lands. There's the Cross-Sector Mitigation Subcommittee, which is really working on developing strategies to meet our emissions reduction requirements. And so as TJ identified, the Global Warming Solutions Act has emissions reductions requirements set up for the years of 2025, 2030, and 2050. And that Cross-Sector Mitigation Subcommittee is really working on how do we achieve those reduction requirements. We have the Just Transition Subcommittee, which is focused on the core equity components that cross all sectors of the work of the Climate Council and the development of the Global Warming Solutions Act. And then we have the Science and Data Subcommittee, which was established by the Climate Council and is really looking at the core science and data needs that are needed across all the subcommittees. They are also working closely with the Public Service Department and the LEAP modeling and the other technical components of the Comprehensive Energy Plan to ensure that we are all, as TJ said, using the same analysis and the same information for the development of the plans. So the subcommittees are following a really clear sequence of work, and I'll identify that for you all here. We started with really looking at what existing programs are currently out there that are both meeting helping us to meet the Global Warming Solutions Act reduction requirements, as well as any sequestration, adaptation, or resilience goals that were set out in the Global Warming Solutions Act. This was both to look at, what programs may need to be modified to ensure that we can meet those requirements, as well as which programs may need to be resourced but are doing a pretty good job working towards those requirements. The subcommittees are then and this is really the process we're at right now, are identifying, analyzing, and evaluating new strategies and programs that are needed to meet the requirements set forth, both for greenhouse gas mitigation reduction requirements, as well as requirements set out in the Global Warming Solutions Act for adaptation, resilience, and sequestration. And this is really where we're at right now, and I'll dive into it a bit more and sort of how we're setting up the recommendations from the Global Warming Solutions Act. But this is obviously an important component of this public engagement today to get information from you all that's going to inform the action development that the subcommittees are working on. And then the last component is really developing the financing strategies for actions that are ready to implement, and that will be coming in as we move into our public engagement process further in September. And once we have finalized actions ready to implement, really looking at those that are ready to go in this first iteration of the climate action plan. So I've mentioned the greenhouse gas reduction requirements for 2025, 2030, and 2050. Those, again, are set out very clearly in the Global Warming Solutions Act. And we really are developing the plan, understanding that we have really one shot this year to get the right actions needed to get us in line to meet those reduction requirements. That being said, the Global Warming Solutions Act also requires a number of additional items that the council must focus on. which include things like smart growth strategies, sequestration and adaptation and storage strategies, achieving net zero emissions across all sectors by 2050, building and encouraging adaptation and resilience in Vermont communities and natural systems, just to name a few. So there's really a broad breadth of work that the Climate Council and its subcommittees are focusing on for the Global Warming Solutions Act. And you all might be hearing a lot about those mitigation reduction requirements, but there are other components required in the act that need to be included in the climate action plan. So after sort of the sequence of work that I've identified, we are looking at developing a monitoring strategy for assessment and for implementation, identifying rules that need to be adopted by ANR by 2022, as well as thinking about those components and plans of work that need to be taken up by the legislature or other bodies of government and state government or other stakeholders involved in the plan. And all of that is leading to the adoption of a climate action plan by December 1st. And as I identified, this plan will be updated every 4 years, and we'll be working closely on public engagement and really implementation of the actions as we move forward. Next slide, please. So framing up the work that we're doing within the Global Warming Solutions Act, the Climate Council and the subcommittees thus far, we've developed a framework for the plan that identifies sort of 3 levels of requirements that the subcommittees have proposed and are working on developing for adoption from the Climate Council. So those are framed up in sort of pathways, strategies, and actions, which help us frame up the work across both those mitigation reduction requirements and the sequestration, adaptation, and resilience components of the Act. So a pathway is really a high-level means of achieving either our greenhouse gas emission reduction requirements or those adaptation, resilience, and sequestration goals, which the subcommittees are working on developing now. Written broadly, pathways are specific enough that we're sort of using them to assess whether progress has been made in achieving those and working towards those in the programs that we're either proposing to adjust or looking to create. Beneath that, we have a number of strategies that are statements of measurable activity to be reached in pursuit of a pathway. And I will say that both pathways and a selection of strategies have been presented to the full Climate Council a couple of meetings ago. All of those presentations and all of those pathways and a selection of strategies from 3 of the subcommittees are available on the Agency of Administration's Climate Council website. So I encourage you all to go there to check out all of the pathways that have been presented to the council thus far. And what we're really digging into right now in the month of August is developing actions and really those who, what, when, where, how operational tasks that state and other stakeholders will undertake to achieve those pathways and strategies. So these are both talking about existing programs or proposing new programs, policies, projects and initiatives, et cetera. And again, this what we're really looking at with, and I'll get into this in the next couple of slides, around developing the climate action plan and engaging with the public on this process is a co-creation process, especially around action. So we're trying to sort of change the dialogue around just taking a plan and presenting it to the public, rather that we have stakeholder events that allow the public to engage with us and co-create these actions that will be presented in the climate action plan. Next slide, please. So as there's a component of equity in the presentation today, I just wanted to highlight that we are really focusing on equity as a core component of all of the work involved in the development of the climate action plan and the work of the Climate Council thus far. The work of the Just Transitions Subcommittee to date has really been defining what a just transitions means for Vermonters, especially for those frontline communities that are impacted by the changes that climate change poses on our natural systems and our working lands and our built environment. Just Transitions has developed a set of guiding principles, which you can also find on the Agency of Administration website. And I've put the definition of how we are defining a just transition for you all on the screen for your reference. I will say that as equity is a core component, we're actually moving into a process of taking those just transitions and a rubric that has been developed by the Just Transitions Subcommittee and actually assessing the actions and strategies that all of the subcommittees are proposing using that equity lens. So we're really trying to move forward with equity as a core component in this process and thinking about it as well as we move into implementation after the adoption of the plan in December. While equity is core to the work that we do and how we build this into the plan moving forward, we are also thinking about co-benefits. mandates and sort of how that fits into the law to put forward cost-effective actions and thinking about feasibility and whether actions make progress towards our requirements and goals. So you can go on to the next slide, please. There we go. So just highlighting those components you'll see in the wheel there. So again, really keeping equity at the core of our conversation, but also considering co-benefits for actions as we weigh actions that are being developed and prioritized in the plan, cost effectiveness, which is mandated in the Global Warming Solutions Act, technical feasibility, and then progress towards the Global Warming Solutions Act requirements. And we're looking at this both for sort of short-term priorities that may be getting us towards our 2025 and 2030 goals, as well as long-term priorities, which may be setting us up for our 2050 goals. And this covers the breadth of the work that the subcommittees are focusing on across mitigation strategies, sequestration, resilience, and adaptation strategies as well. Next slide, please. So a review of the process to date. I will say that all meetings thus far for the Climate Council and for its subcommittees have been open to the public, and we've been really excited to see we've had a really robust public engagement thus far in the public meetings, but also understanding that we need to do better in terms of our public engagement. So we started with defining the work and refining the work of the subcommittees, taking the charge that was identified in the Global Warming Solutions Act and having the Climate Council adopt those as the work plans for the subcommittees. The subcommittees were assigned co-chairs, and the Climate Council took a really detailed look at the membership of each subcommittee, ensuring that we had a diverse representation of technical expertise and diversity across communities within Vermont. We then broke down the work plans that were adopted by the Climate Council for task leads within the subcommittees, and they were really starting looking at pathways and then strategies and actions, as I identified earlier, for recommendation to the Climate Council for adoption in the plan. We've worked on a number of presentation and discussion components, as today is one of those. And really thinking about how we present this both to technical experts and stakeholders, but also the public as we move forward. And then we'll obviously presented pathways a couple of meetings ago to the full Climate Council and are continuing to do so with strategies and actions. This process is going to continue, as I said earlier, as we look to refine actions and co-create them with the public moving into September and beyond, and then adoption of the Climate Action Plan and further refinement beyond that December 1st deadline. Next slide, please. So this brings me to my last slide about public engagement, and sort of that process slide previously teased this up quite well. So we have a very robust public engagement timeline, given the tight timeline we have for adoption of this breadth of work by December 1st. We had extensive public engagement even prior to the Global Warming Solutions Act being passed, which was really fantastic in shaping the work of the subcommittees and the charge to the Climate Council. As I said, we have been trying to think about public engagement in a new way. So rather than having folks just react to a plan at the end, have it be a co-creation process with the public. So stakeholder engagement through meetings like this, as well as other broader public engagement meetings we'll be hosting in September, and 3 additional stakeholder meetings later in September will help us with that co-creation process for strategies and actions, and really diving into the details of what we're proposing in the Climate Action Plan. In addition to those stakeholder events, we have broader public engagement events planned for both online and in person through the month of September, and then further refinement of our actions and policies after the initial plan is launched in December. So we will be coming back with some really interesting tools, deliberative polling platforms to look at those actions that we can continue to refine even after December. So with that, I know I went through it quickly, but I'll turn it back to TJ to discuss where the Comprehensive Energy Plan and Climate Action Plan overlap and where they may differ.
Great, thanks, Marian. Yeah, so what you've just heard, there was a ton of overlap in terms of talk about climate mitigation, cost effectiveness, equity, public engagement efforts, and just the analysis that's going on. That's really the overlap, and I do think that is the bigger portion of the Venn diagram here as it's represented, that there is a lot of overlap between the energy plan and the climate plan. But that said, they do have their own distinct components. So the Climate Action Plan Also is looking at climate adaptation, looking at non-energy greenhouse gas emissions in terms of agriculture, waste, et cetera, and sequestration policies. It's also got it specifically called out the greenhouse gas inventory review. I'm also a co-chair of the Science and Data Committee, so that one's a little near and dear to my heart. We've spent a lot of time on that one lately with a lot of great public engagement, and excited to move forward there as well. On the comprehensive energy plan side, we're also focused on renewable energy development. As I mentioned, the electric plan with reliability, but just broader energy system planning. So climate adaptation a little bit, but really in terms of the adequacy, security, and reliability of the electric grid and grid optimization. Affordability, economic vitality, those other tenets that are really in state energy policy. And then of course, kind of drilling down to provide guidance for local planning in Act 174. So there's a lot going on. I know it's been a lot of work for those who have participated in both efforts so far, but we're really excited because it has been a coordinated effort and moving forward in parallel here. And hopefully we can have two good, useful plans, but not if we don't get good input. And that's what we're here for today. So next slide, please. So I think we'll leave some space here for some clarifying questions. We do have space in the agenda for discussion. Our next presentation will be broadly talking about equity to kind of get in our frame of mind. But are there clarifying questions about the comprehensive energy plan or CAP process? I think just raise your hand if you have a question, or if Philip, there's questions in the chat, please let us know. So I am not hearing any. I said our next presentation was on equity, but I think I may have skipped a presentation. Before we talk about that, I'm going to go quickly over. Oh, you can go to the next slide. Thanks. I'm going to go to where are we now and just provide some quick context setting for the building sector. I have about 15 slides here. I'm going to try and do them in 15 minutes or less so that, again, we have more time for discussion. So at a high level, why are we focusing on the thermal sector? Well, we're over a third of Vermont's energy expenditures, over a third of its greenhouse gas emissions, and almost half of its energy use. So it's a big deal here. I think this is familiar to everybody, but it's important to highlight and remind ourselves why we're focusing here. Next slide. So where does that come from? You can see that there's only about 25% of the site energy sources are renewable. We have a mix of fuel oil, natural gas, and propane. And of that renewability, a lot of it is wood, between cordwood, wood pellets, wood chips. Advanced wood heat is not specifically called out, but a growing share. And then renewable electricity. So that's our thermal supply served by electricity, and then the portion of that is renewable as accounted for by renewable energy credits. Next slide. And just setting, there's a lot of text on this slide, but I also just want to set the context of Vermont energy policy, and there's a lot of it. I mentioned 202A, our general state energy policy, so I won't read that again, but it is really the foundation for how we move forward. There's a lot of other considerations in statute. We have renewable energy goals, talking about retaining and growing renewable energy jobs and developing viable markets for renewables and efficiency projects. We have weatherization goals, 80% housing units improved by 2020, a goal that we did not meet by quite a bit. I'll talk a little bit more about that. But also to, when we go into a home, to do it comprehensively. Excuse me. We have our 25 by 25 state goal that's still on the books, 25% of our energy consumed within the state through the through the use of renewable energy sources. And then other areas with energy efficiency guidance where there's guidance provided in statute on how we think about cost effectiveness and prioritizing our efficiency budgets, how much funding to collect. Least cost planning has been something on the books for a really long time from our electric utilities. They require comprehensive energy efficiency programs, but also just to require generally least cost planning, including environmental considerations. So there's others in statute. This are just a few of the main ones, but there's a lot of guidance out there that our legislature has provided. Next slide, please. So I will quickly go through some of the programs that are here, and then we'll allow for some clarifying questions as well. So I'm going to start with our energy efficiency utilities. Efficiency Vermont, Burlington Electric Department, Vermont Gas Systems. I mentioned Section 209 of Title 30 that creates an energy efficiency charge. So that's ratepayer funded programs. And that's for the electric side. These also have thermal efficiency services that are funded by Vermont's participation in the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative and the forward capacity market that the legislature has directed to support thermal fuels. Each of these programs, I won't go into detail, but they offer residential, commercial, multifamily efficiency services to customers. Next slide, please. But we do have some specific commercial customer programs that are worth calling out specifically. So we have the self-managed energy efficiency program, and that allows certain eligible transmission industrial customers to be exempt from the efficiency charge, but then they could commit, but they have to commit to a minimum annual investment in efficiency over a 3-year time frame. It's either $1 million a year or $500,000 a year, depending on the size of the company. And that's relevant here in the thermal sector when we're talking about thermal, because they can use what they would have paid on their electric bill to support both electric and thermal efficiency. Energy savings accounts is another option for customers paying over $5,000 a year in their electric efficiency charge. They can opt to self-manage through an energy savings account. There's also an energy savings account pilot where customers can use those funds again for thermal measures, and that pilot runs for another 1.5 years, I believe. There's a customer credit program, which is another option for large users of energy that's dormant right now, so I'm not going to go into detail. But also the state energy management program, which this really is the administration of all the energy management measures in all state buildings and facilities, including efficiency and renewable fuels. It's implemented through a partnership with Efficiency Vermont and using some of the funding, but the measures are supported, the capital cost is often supported through 2 revolving loan funds that finance the measures. And so they've been able to do a lot of work on state buildings. And I think these are relevant to consider as we go forward. Are they good? Are there opportunities to improve? Are there opportunities to use these to jump off of? Next slide, please. In terms of funding for thermal and process efficiency funding, I should have had a specific slide for our weatherization programs offered by the Office of Economic Opportunity. And I apologize, Sarah, for not doing that. But they both gross receipts tax on natural gas and electricity plus 2 cents a gallon on fuel oil, propane, and kerosene, and some federal funds go to support programs that for income eligible customers in the state. And you can see the budgets here going forward, and you can see, I think importantly, where our low income weatherization is relatively stable, and that's a combination of all the funds there. The revenues from the forward capacity market and from the forward capacity market specifically are expected to drop off significantly in 2024. So the funding for thermal process efficiency is going down for non-low income customers outside of Vermont gas territory. So you can also see the blue line there. Vermont gas recently was approved by the Public Utility Commission to to roughly double their budget over time to ramp up efficiency in their territory. All told, that totals about $25 million of or a little more of spending on thermal process fuel efficiency. Next slide, please. So where has that spending got us in the past? Well, this is the annual housing units retrofitted by provider. And you remember I mentioned the 80,000 units by 2020 goal that we haven't gotten to. This totals cumulatively about 30,000 homes weatherized. So we fell well short of that goal. There was a bump in funding with some federal funds from the ARA days in the early 2010s. And then you can see we've been roughly 2,000 homes a year weatherized for the last several years. Next slide, please. I do want to talk about some innovations that have happened recently in our efficiency programs, because they start to cross spreader wings, if you will. And the first one here is a flexible load management pilot. So recognizing the integration of the electric sector and building sector, and how electrification is really has been taking off. We really need to be able to manage our load and to allow for more electrification if that is the right path, and to just manage the impacts to the grid. And so there's a flexible load management pilot that Efficiency Vermont is undertaking with a few $1 million to really ensure that when technologies are going into homes, that they're controllable, and then the utilities then on their side can, when it's cost effective and in the interest of the state, and interest of least cost planning, they then can control those measures. Also, greenhouse gas performance metrics have been added to our efficiency utility performance requirements. And so really focusing not just on the MMBTU saved, but really on saving greenhouse gases. One specific program that is highlighted in, I think, or that it ties in with that, I should say, is a refrigerant management program. A lot of greenhouse gases are emitted not just from the energy use associated for cooling, for example, but also the refrigerants that are in the cooling systems. If those leak, they have a global warming potential many times that of carbon, orders of magnitude. And so if we can, while saving energy, manage refrigerants either through replacing with lower global warming potential refrigerants, or just reducing leaks altogether, that is going to go a long way towards meeting our goals. I will note that, as we talk about heat pumps, we really need to consider this as well. Heat pumps do use refrigerants. And finally, something that's just started, the department, in partnership with the Office of Economic Opportunity, Department of Health, and soon to be Efficiency Vermont and our efficiency utilities are going to be starting a weatherization and health pilot, really recognizing the health impacts of weatherization go far beyond just the energy impacts, and trying to better communicate and that with our healthcare providers and insurers to understand that it's really a win-win. You can save energy, but also have healthy outcomes, and try and see if there's opportunities there for investment from the healthcare industry. Next slide. Building energy standards. The state, through the Department of Public Service, every 3 years promulgates rules to update our building energy standards in the residential sector since the late 90s, in the commercial sector since 2007. There is no statewide enforcement mechanism. That compliance in the commercial sector is still very high, around 90%. In the residential sector, 2/3 of homes comply with the building energy codes. So there's the opportunity to, there's also stretch codes that are available. Those are not statewide requirements, but they do apply to Act 250 projects and can be adopted by municipalities to have more stringent requirements in their towns. And those are updated, like I said, every 3 years. Also relevant for today's discussion, we have a couple of energy assistance programs, at least a couple. There's the LIHEAP program, which really assists low-income households in meeting the immediate home energy needs, like fuel bills, and help, paying to have their home heated. That is federally funded. We also have energy assistance programs from our utilities. Green Mountain Power, Vermont Gas Systems offer a discount on rates for income qualifying customers. Those are funded by ratepayers. On the supply side, the Clean Energy Development Fund has focused on advanced wood heating incentives over the last several years, including automated pellet boilers, advanced wood heating, and efficient wood stove changeout program. They've also supported the chip and bulk pellet heating market, trying to get suppliers into Vermont. There is no future dedicated funding. The Clean Energy Development Fund did get an ARPA appropriation for a low-income community clean energy program going forward. But aside from that, there is no future kind of sustainable funding for the Clean Energy Development Fund right now. The renewable energy standard, this is in Act 56 of, that says 2017, it was of 2015. It started in 2017 as a requirement on our distribution utilities to cause fossil fuel reductions for their customers. And so the utilities now have discretion to choose programs that actually reduce fossil fuel customers, and they still have the least cost planning requirement, so they need to do that in the most cost-effective way possible. In the charts here, you can see where the measures have landed. In 2019, it was almost half of the requirement was met through the support of cold climate heat pumps. Actually, yeah, almost half. There's other measures such as battery storage, where it has short-term impacts on fuel use of the regional grid. Electric vehicles are talked about a lot, a small portion of their savings claims, and custom measures. you can see over time, the measure distribution in 2017, custom measures were really the bulk of where utilities were getting their savings, line extensions to diesel sugar makers, for example. But as that kind of low-hanging fruit has been harder and harder to come by, the mix of measures has changed a little bit over time. Again, the utilities have discretion at least cost on how best to do this. Weatherization is actually an eligible measure, but I believe only one utility is offering any support through weatherization here as part of their Tier 3 program. Next slide, please. We talked about heat pumps as part of Tier 3. The efficiency utilities also support heat pumps, and you can see over time we've had a big adoption of heat pumps. So we have almost, I think that's almost 40,000 heat pumps installed at the end of 2021. Once this year is through, 90% of those are going into residential buildings, about 10% into commercial. On the right-hand side, we have our projections of how many heat pumps we could have over time. Let's note that red line, the medium case there, is what is used in our LEAP modeling going forward, and we're actually ahead of that trajectory in getting 12,000 heat pumps in 2021 annually. We will be at 50,000 by 2022, a few years ahead of that schedule. So a lot of heat pumps are going in, so it brings up a whole lot of policy questions that I hope we can get into going forward. I think this is my last slide here in setting the context here, but I just wanted to also note thermal supply prices. Electric resistance is inefficient and expensive, and you can see kind of the range of options here. So on an operating basis, this is last winter, so it's not today. Some costs are higher than this slide shows, but in November of 2020, natural gas was operationally the cheapest way to heat your home. Cold climate heat pump on average was kind of in the middle here. So when we think about just as we think about different policies in going forward, we should think about the cost, and we need to think about the perspective and making sure that customers understand cost and understand understanding cost is really important to understand where we need to put our policy pressure. If we want to support one path or another, we may need to have a different policy here. So with that, I think next slide. I'll ask for clarifying questions on the state of the state, or just questions. I think we have a little time to do some questions. And if Philip, if you could let me know if there's anything in the chat, or if folks want to raise their hand, can go that route.
Sure. TJ, Richard Fazy has raised his hand. And Richard, you can, well, you're already unmuted, so you can go ahead and ask.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay. So this is back, TJ, on a previous slide about state policies. You had one slide there.
Right.
I just wanted to raise the issue and just make sure it's on the table around our siloed policies between efficiency and renewables, and just suggest that it may be time to re-examine whether those still make sense, because we're beginning to see some blurring occurring, and some of the barriers that those silos impose on programs that have the potential for us to achieve, make progress towards our 90% renewable goal. For example, the Zero Energy Now program that incorporates weatherization, renewable fuels, heat pumps primarily, and solar, doesn't fit well with the efficiency utility construct. And additionally, there's some new technologies that we're looking at. For instance, solar assisted heat pump. Does this fit as a efficiency measure when the refrigerant is attached to a panel that can be placed on the outside of the home and be more efficient potentially than taking heat from inside the house for domestic hot water heating purposes? So is that a renewable device, or is it an efficiency device? So I don't have an answer. I just want to raise this as a topic that should probably be examined as part of this process. Thank you.
So Richard, I'm going to ask TJ to respond, but I also would ask that you send your comments via email or snail mail so that the full context of what you're saying gets captured. And I'm going to pass it over to TJ for a response.
Sorry, I had muted myself. Thank you, Richard. That's a really good point, and exactly the type of thing that would be great to raise and elevate when we talk about decision-making framework and how we consider trade-offs. It sounds like what you're saying is kind of the fundamental policy is too siloed in how we consider those trade-offs, and I hope you can raise that in the breakouts and in further discussion. I think it's an excellent point. Thank you for making it. And thank you. I just will note too that our technical issues are solved at least in part, and that was the voice of Cindy Cook, our from Adam and Accord, our facilitator for today.
And TJ, this is Philip. If I can go to the next question, and this may be for a department colleague, Kelly or Barry. Matt Coda is interested in knowing which towns or maybe how many towns have adopted stretch codes.
Yeah, I can answer that. This is Kelly. Well, I can answer the question, but I don't know the answer. We actually aren't aware of any towns that have adopted the stretch code at this point. The department's not notified. I'm not saying there aren't any, but we are not aware of any.
And there's also a question in the chat. Thanks, Kelly. There's also a question in the chat for you, TJ. This is from Chase. He asks, and this is the slide that you had up a couple minutes ago, I believe, of different fuel source costs. Do the costs just described account for the social cost of carbon caused by greenhouse gas emissions?
So the answer to that is no. It's a really it's a good question, and I stumbled a little bit on that slide in what I was trying to communicate. I think I really just wanted to show that customers have choices on which fuel to use, and we need to take that into account and understanding the customer cost as at least one perspective. Those costs are not not the full cost of using a fuel from a societal perspective at all. They do not include the social cost of carbon.
And I don't see any other hands raised or questions in the chat right now.
Okay. Thanks, Philip. So are we ready to move on to the next slide?
Yes, I think so.
So Sarah.
Yeah, so I'll introduce Sarah really briefly. Sarah Phillips is the director of the Office of Economic Opportunity with the state of Vermont, and among other things runs the weatherization programs, but also has been a co-chair of the Just Transitions Committee of the Climate Council. And Really excited, and thank you, Sarah, for coming today to kind of level set us and talk how we think about equity in the buildings and thermal sector.
Great, thanks, TJ. And you just introduced me, so that was great. I can skip that part, but I will say I'm excited to jump on the tail end of an hour of really full information. And I think that my task here today, in a really relatively short amount of time, is to try to get our juices flowing a little bit for the conversations that we're about to have in small groups, and to get our juices flowing in terms of how we think about equity in the buildings and thermal sector. So I want to just recognize that, let's see, and TJ introduced me, but I will say one of the things that folks don't always realize about OEO, so we also administer the emergency heating system repair and replacement program as well, so that's worth a mention. And also Marion did a great job of just teeing up the work of the Just Transition Subcommittee, and I'm going to borrow pretty heavily on that work this morning and thinking about equity in our conversation here. And so I just wanted to recognize also that many of you have been a part of this conversation as a part of the Climate Council's work, or in other at other tables that you participate in. So I don't assume that we're all coming to this conversation with sort of a zero understanding around equity, but rather my job is to try and kind of tap into that part of your brain that thinks about equity and really pull it to the front for our conversation, and maybe give you a couple new ideas to think about. So the Just Transition Subcommittee is really, again, part of the Global Warming Solutions Act. Our task is really focused on helping the council with to guide and evaluate its work in consideration of thinking about the disproportionate impact that climate change has on rural, low-income, BIPOC, and other marginalized communities, and then thinking about the impact as we transition away from greenhouse gas emission jobs towards a more green jobs economy. The Just Transition Subcommittee has drafted some guiding principles, as Marianne nicely pointed to, and if after 15 minutes of listening to me talk this morning, you want to hear more, we also had a recorded workshop where we dove into those principles together as well, so you can spend some more time thinking about this. So obviously, one of the first things that we have to do when we talk about equity is to kind of think about a definition or an understanding of what we mean when we say equity. And there's obviously a very simple understanding of it, but I think this work kind of begs us to take a more complex understanding. So the way that a lot of us think about equity is really from a distributive perspective, right? Which is thinking about how we fairly share benefits and burdens, recognizing that there's existing disparities, and so it's not about everybody getting the same slice of pie for the same price. Distributive equity is about targeting resources to communities where there's the greatest inequities, there's the disproportionate impacts, greatest unmet needs. So who's the hungriest? Who has never gotten a slice of pie? Whose pie has always been really expensive? We should be thinking about getting them a bigger slice of pie and charging them less for it. So that's sort of the classic way that we think about equity. But I think procedural equity is a really important part of this work as well, and kind of pulls from an environmental justice lens, which really points to the fact that communities should really have a say in policies and programs that affect them. And so process really, really matters when it comes to thinking about equity and justice. And so it's not just about public hearings like this one that are virtual and scheduled during the daytime. It's also about some of those other public engagement strategies that the Climate Council is really working to employ as well. Contextual equity really recognizes that there are underlying structural and institutional systems and causes to inequity that we also need to address. It's not about just thinking about equity in this one silo for a particular issue. And then corrective equity would really be about, great, we think equity is important, we want to do it right. How are we held accountable to that, and how are we, what are those processes of accountability so that others can hold us accountable? So then if we're going to think about disproportionate impact, if we're going to talk about existing inequities, then who exactly, what communities are we really talking about, right? So this is, I think, a really important piece of thinking about equity and justice is the who. And in the Climate Council work, we in the Just Transition Subcommittee have really focused in on these 4 areas. And so I've pulled those out today, thinking about who's exposed to climate risk, who's most vulnerable. We tend to stay away from the term vulnerable, but really we're talking about vulnerability to climate change and the risks associated with climate change. Who's experienced oppression and racism, who has less resources available to adapt, who has bared the brunt of pollution and negative effects from our fossil fuel economy, and who's more likely to experience a job transition. I think one of the things that's missing when you start to think about a list like this and factors is that a lot of these overlay on top of each other, right? So it's not that there's an impacted community isn't just impacted because they are exposed to greater health risks related to climate. They also may have experienced oppression and racism, or also may be very low income and have less resources. So I think when these start to layer on top of each other, you get a sense of why we think about equity in terms of impacted communities. You know, and this is just another way to sort of look at it, is what are some of the factors that we're thinking about. You can start to see when you think about it or tease it out this way, that it's really about much more than income, right? And so some of the factors that are really known to impact climate vulnerability, things like language barriers, income, living conditions, occupation, age, health, location, living with a disability is another one. So just recognizing that that what we really need to be doing is thinking much broader than just about income. And oftentimes we get stuck in that mindset and thinking about low and moderate income as being the way that we need to think about equity issues in this space. And I think it's obviously much broader than that. So this is some examples of impacted communities that the Just Transitions Committee has provided. It's not an exhaustive list, but it's meant to sort of bring to light some of the different communities that we sometimes might overlook when we try to just use an economic equity lens. I'll give one example in thinking about impacted communities in Vermont, might be mobile home communities, right? Because we know that they're particularly vulnerable to flooding in Vermont. We also know that mobile homes tend to be less efficient, that there's more home repair issues. We also know some of the most affordable housing in Vermont, and so that disproportionately more low-income Vermonters live in mobile home parks. So again, it's not enough to just say low-income Vermonters. We need to have a more nuanced understanding of what we're talking about. So if we want to sort of start to move to thinking more about thermal and building equity issues in Vermont, I've borrowed some graphics from the Energy Action Network here to pull out and pull our mind back to that space. And so obviously one of the first things we think about is thinking about energy burden. I think that's not a new concept to many people, but it's really thinking about the highest or the percentage of income towards energy costs and who has the highest energy burden. We know that high energy burden really matters because it's not just about money, it's also about what that means in terms of other people's overall financial well-being, has impact on health and safety for households as well. And so obviously low-income Vermonters have the highest energy burden, but I think what's really great about this graphic is that you can see that low-income Vermonters, it's actually the very lowest income Vermonters that have the highest energy burden. And we know that low-income Vermonters purchase less energy, but have the highest energy burden. So they don't have the highest energy burden because they purchase more energy, they just have the highest energy burden. And then if we want to get a little bit more nuanced about it, right, we can start to look at household fuel use by income. And so here on this chart, you can see that lower income households use fuel oil and electricity more frequently and utility gas and wood less frequently than higher income households. I think what's really interesting, and again, points us to thinking about equity issues beyond just the simple sort of economic equity lens, is that housing type actually has, in some ways, more impact than income in terms of energy use. So renters actually use less wood and more electricity compared to homeowners, and they use electricity for heating more often. The lowest income renters even more so. And I'll just layer on top of this, I don't have a slide to show it, but just to say that we know that Black, Indigenous, and people of color in Vermont are also far less likely to own homes, and that we have a disparity when it comes to racial disparity in terms of home ownership. So you can, again, start to see how these things layer on top of each other a little bit. So I just, again, want to share some initial thoughts, a little bit coming from the space of low-income weatherization, but just thinking about getting our juices flowing in terms of how we can think about equity in our conversations later this morning. Again, I'll just go back to, I think we really need to have a more nuanced understanding of who we're talking about, who's been left out, who's been disproportionately impacted when we're thinking about equity. I think equity really begs us to think better about how we improve access. It's not just about funding or financing, although that is a critical piece of this. And I'll appreciate the point that funding and financing are different terms, but it's not even just about funding and financing. It's also about less complexity to programs. It's also about less time, easier to participate. It's about programs sometimes that are about universal access, but it's also sometimes about more targeted initiatives, right? So sometimes we do need to have a targeted initiative to reach a specific community or specific geography. And sometimes it's about reducing barriers to entry, and that can be as simple in some policies or programs about opt-out versus opt-in. I think fundamentally, when we think about equity, we need to think about how we offset burdens and costs. We need to think not just about how does this program or policy disproportionately impact different communities potentially, but how do we mitigate that in the work that we're doing, or how do we mitigate that disproportionate impact, or how do we mitigate any sort of burdens or costs for impacted communities? And then the flip side of that would be, how do we maximize benefits? So in weatherization, this is us thinking about when we're in someone's home, what else can we bring to the table? And that really ties into us a holistic approach, because we know that to do weatherization in our housing stock in Vermont, it also means we need to do some home repair issues while we're there. It also means we need to address vermiculite issues. It also means that we need to look at the heating system in the building. It also means that we need to be able to connect that household to other resources that are going to be able to help them address the health and energy issues and the home-related issues. So it's really taking that more holistic approach. There's some great examples of that in other parts of the country, how we pair together funding, not just in the energy space, but again, bringing in resources around lead paint or healthy homes, and some of the weatherization health initiative stuff that TJ mentioned earlier. I think is a great opportunity for us to continue to think about this. And then finally, I have to say workforce, because anytime we start to think about this workforce really comes up. And so workers are really critical to weatherization, to all of this work, because if we really want to realize the energy savings, we need trained and qualified workforce, right? We can't do it without that. And we want those jobs that we're creating to be meaningful, life-sustaining, and really valued work. It's hard work, and that means that we need to be thinking about well-paying jobs with benefits, strong and fair labor standards, and fundamentally, we need to diversify our workforce in the weatherization field as well. So the last thing that I'll just leave us with today, and I think I'm almost at time, so that's good, is how do we know if we are improving equity? And so there's some borrowed and adapted measures from the U.S. Department of Energy's Clean Energy for Low-Income Communities Accelerator Initiative, and just some ways, again, to help us think about equity issues and how we can be thinking about whether we're really achieving our goals in terms of when we're thinking about how we measure that. So I'll just leave that there and wrap it up, and happy to answer any questions.
Great, thanks, Sarah, and look forward to questions. If you have a question, raise your hand or put something in chat, and Philip will raise it. So not hearing any questions, Sarah. One question I have is, what can people do most to enhance equity going forward? What would you recommend?
Oh, Sydney, that's a big question.
I know.
I mean, really,
yeah.
I love that you're asking it. I love that you're asking a big question. I feel like we could spend all day just on that question in any of these groups that we're about to break into. I mean, maybe I'll push it back and say, I don't know that I'm an expert on equity. I don't know that that's what I'm really bringing to the table. I'm doing a lot of work in this space right now by nature of my work on the Climate Council and of course in the Low-Income Weatherization Program, which is administered by our office, but really by Jeff Wilcox, who's here as well today. But I think a lot of us are working in this space, so I don't feel a sense of ownership of knowing what's the right path forward. I think one of the biggest things we need to do is we need to be collecting data on equity. We need to be asking the question. We need to be willing to do things differently so that we can reach impacted communities. And we need to stop saying that equity is about reaching low and moderate income Vermonters, because it's much more nuanced than that. So if there's one takeaway, I think that's one of the biggest things that we could be thinking about doing.
Thanks.
And Cindy, I see that Chad has raised his hand and is ready to speak.
Yes, Chad.
Good morning. Hi, my name is Chad with the Vermont Housing Finance Agency. I'm wondering if you could provide, has the Just Transition Subcommittee discussed any examples to point to specifically to the building sector that could be models that we take a look at?
So the way that we've structured the simple answer to that is no, but that's because the way that we've structured our work is that we're really a subcommittee in service to the rest of the Climate Council. And when Marion says that we put equity at the core of the work, it's meant that we've really looked to empower all of the subcommittees to integrate this equity lens into their own work, rather than us doing sort of feeding in sector specific recommendations or doing an after the fact analysis. We've really tried to create principles and tools and assessment questions that help the subject matter experts start to integrate equity. So it's just not been the way that we've designed our work. But I do think there are some examples out there. Some folks in this space probably have some good examples as well. I'm happy to share a couple that I can think of, after too as well, if there's something specific.
Philip, are there other questions, hands raised?
Yes, there are two questions from the chat. First, Emma Hansen asks, are the equity guidelines specific to Vermonters or are they global? She asks because she thinks about the impact of oil refineries on marginalized communities that are outside of Vermont, but are used to create the fuels used inside of Vermont.
Yeah, I think that's right. We're definitely interconnected, right? Vermont's not a bubble when you think about issues of climate justice or equity. You have to think outside our borders as well. I can say that the Just Transition Subcommittee has developed guiding principles, some assessment questions, and a rubric that Marion mentioned, sort of a scoring tool that have flowed out of those guiding principles. They are really meant to speak to an analysis of recommendations in Vermont, but also really identifying that there are indeed impacts of our actions outside of Vermont as well. But the analysis itself is on impacted communities in Vermont and equity analysis for Vermont specifically. I will say that there's a lot of work in this space globally and across the nation, and so I don't want to pretend to speak for all of that, but there are a lot of states are doing this work around equity and energy equity and climate justice. Just Transitions is a global movement. And so if that's of interest to anyone, you can do a little Googling and you'll find a lot out there.
And there was a second question, Philip?
Yes, and Jared Duval did provide one EAN reference response to it, but I think it's worth asking. This question is from Carol. Is there any data on vehicle fuel costs for various income level households?
Yeah, I was actually going to defer to Jared on that one as well, because I think EAN has some of the best data they've pulled together on that. There's some limitations in terms of what data is available, but I think EAN's a good place to look. Energy Action Network. Sorry.
And Anne had a comment. Sarah, you touched on all the issues close to Heat Squad, the home energy audit program, and glad that you mentioned workforce development. Sarah notices that there is a big waiting list for weatherization help needed by low-income Vermonters in the areas where the Heat Squad works. And that's not specifically to the BIPOC community, but relevant to the equity discussion.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I'll just say that the low-income weatherization program is, which is a great example of a program which really does make weatherization available and accessible to low-income Vermonters. And we have work to do in that program as well to reach different parts of the state and different communities. And you'll see a big campaign this summer as we are expanding weatherization and looking to build up folks coming in the program. So where there has been a waiting list a long time, I know that's been on everyone's mind. In some communities, we know that waiting list is actually very low. So I would encourage you, this is the right moment in time to be reaching out and helping folks apply for the weatherization program.
Thank you. And I see TJ Poor has a question.
Well, it's not a question for Sarah per se, but I just wanted to ask. I know there's a lot of folks who work in programs in this meeting, and two parts. If there's any experiences that or things you put into effect that were really useful, like organizational policies that really kind of changed the culture of your organization or really focused you in an area that you weren't going. Remember, this workshop is for us to gather your input, so we want to kind of set the stage and stoke the conversation. But so if folks want to share any successes or challenges that they've had in this space, I think that would be great. And then specifically, I think I really still have a question on data, because I think, Sarah, you mentioned a couple of data sources and metrics. On that last slide, you have a few metrics, and I'm not sure we actually have the data to really understand that. And I know we don't have it on a regional or municipal level, keeping in mind our Act 174 requirements. So I want to throw out those two kind of issues for discussion here. It's not for anybody in particular to answer, and maybe I should call somebody out, but hopefully somebody is willing to chime in and provide some input.
Jared Duval's hand has gone up.
Thanks, Philip. Really appreciate this conversation. I just wanted to note that the link that I shared earlier was a graph that had data from the U.S. Department of Transportation, their National Household Travel Survey in 2017. I would just note that in previous years, I think it was around 2008, 9, or 10, there was sufficient sampling of Vermont where we could have Vermont-specific numbers. But the last National Household Travel Survey that was done did not include sufficient sampling of Vermont to get Vermont-specific numbers. So that's why that data is presented on a regional basis in terms of the Northeast US, looking at rural versus urban communities in the Northeast US. I'm also looking to find another presentation on transportation equity that I'll put as a resource in the chat. But I do think that the level of analysis and how refined it can be in terms of national versus regional versus state versus kind of at the regional within a state level or town level really depends on the data collection efforts. And I think it is really important that when there are things happening like a national household travel survey or other kind of national survey efforts that Vermont can be a part of and kind of tag onto to make sure we get sufficient sample size to inform our efforts here. Those are really important opportunities.
Thanks, Jared. Are there other questions or comments?
Thank you, David. Dave Westman, your hand is up. I was gonna tee something else up specifically for you. So. Good time.
Hello, everyone, and yeah, thanks for the question, TJ. For those who may not know, Efficiency Vermont is very actively engaged in determining efficiency's role in all of the Vermont communities, and focusing on diversity, equity, inclusion as part of our program is really something that's sort of come to light in the last year. And so we are currently conducting a pretty robust study and outreach plan to ensure that we are providing efficiency services for all of the Vermont communities. This is challenging, as TJ mentioned, because the metrics are incredibly hard to track. To just sort of put the most obvious metric and data problem in front of everyone is, we do not collect any demographic data with Efficiency Vermont program participants. And in fact, we feel pretty strongly that we shouldn't, because collecting that type of information may actually be a barrier for some members in communities from participating in efficiency programs. And, to just get a flavor of that is, if you followed the news last year during the census, there's a lot of concern about how specific census questions could actually prevent members of communities from participating in that. And so we do have some concerns about collecting demographic data in order to demonstrate how effectively we're reaching out to those communities. I will say two things on where I think we are making good progress, though. First off is that the Efficiency Vermont has been delivering efficiency for Vermonters for over 20 years. And for a large chunk of that, we've had a very specific requirement to deliver our services equitably across the entire geography of Vermont. And so that is by county, where a portion of our services have to be directed to counties in proportion, rough proportion to the population. So that ensures that, for example, areas of the Northeast Kingdom that are sparsely populated are still getting a proportional share of benefits and services from the community, from Efficiency Vermont, I should say. So I think that is actually really important, because if you think of a geographic breakout of where Vermonters are, if you're trying to hit the population where they live in some proportion, I think you're doing a pretty good job. And so what we have found is that requirement for our services has largely been met over the last decade plus that we've had that requirement in place. The second thing that I wanted to mention is that in the last few years, we've had a couple opportunities to essentially increase our incentives based on income qualifications. And the projects that we're talking about here today, thermal projects, are not cheap. And while they do have a greenhouse gas impact for the state, the energy savings are not terribly high in comparison to the cost of the projects. These projects are not 1 or 2 year paybacks in most cases. These are, in some cases, long-term investments. And so there's a large portion of low-income customers who don't qualify for the OEO services, but really can't come up with an $8,000 to $10,000 weatherization cost, at the drop of a hat. Many Vermonters cannot come up with that, even if it's required. So what we have learned is that moderate income and low to moderate income bonuses for participation can actually drive an increase in participation. And so what that really tells us is that incentives in this space matter, and that helping to lower that initial cost of entry is really important. That's why we're also partnering very closely with VHFA on long-term financing opportunities. That's an exciting development that we hope will sort of broaden the opportunity for participation across a larger breadth of Vermonters, so that it's not just what we call market rate incentives, but actually penetrating into some of these harder to reach Vermonters.
Thanks, David. Any other comments or questions?
I might just add, thanks, David. I really appreciate that. I just want to say it's fascinating to me. I want to add to this mix that a universal approach like EVT would not be collecting demographic data. And I don't say that in an accusatory way. But I just want to point out that programs that target low-income Vermonters, and especially very low-income Vermonters, almost always are required to collect demographic and income information. So I just want to add that into the mix, that if the reason that we don't want to do it is that it would lower barriers to entrance for impacted communities, then I just want to say that the targeted programs are already required to do that. So it's kind of an interesting dynamic for me.
Great. Thanks. Other comments, questions?
Cindy,
So-
there are two questions. I'm going to read one from the chat, and then afterwards, Paul Zabriskie also wants to ask one. But let me read the chat one, which is from John Woodward. How does housing affordability or access, or lack of affordability and access fit into the just transition principles that the council is working with? And also, how does it fit with energy policy equity concerns in general?
Well, I can respond to the latter part of that question in terms of the energy policy. Affordability is really written right into that foundational statute, and so it kind of hits the nail right on the head, and is really critical to how we go forward. When I think about our last year, the department did with ACCD a study on the economic impacts of weatherization, and it was hugely economic for the state, not only for the economic impact of construction, but then it made homes more affordable, which then kind of rolled into kind of just better outcomes for the state. Not only did it do that, but then it reduced energy use, reduced emissions. And it's like wins all across the board. And but affordability really has those, it seems like it has those, if you can craft a policy that really meets that affordability metric, you're really doing well in terms of meeting our broader energy policy needs. I guess I'll leave the the more focused equity and just transitions question to Sarah or others.
Well, I mean, I really appreciate that question, John, because I do a lot of work in the affordable housing and homelessness space as well as part of our work at OEO. And I absolutely see weatherization and this work that we're talking about as connected to housing affordability and housing issues in Vermont and housing policy. A home is a home. It's not just a shell that we're filling with insulation. And we have one of the oldest housing stocks in the country, and making those homes, whether they be rental or homes that are owned and occupied, and making them healthier, making them more safe, improving that housing stock is really critical part to our housing policy in Vermont. So I think they're definitely connected.
And
Philip, I think there was another question.
yes, Paul Zabriskie, please go ahead.
Hi, thank you for this rich discussion. I would just like to raise a question as to whether the metric that Efficiency Vermont has been given for distribution of resources by county on a per capita basis is in fact, is it equal but not equitable? And the reason I raise this is in rural communities around the state, people have a higher per MMBTU cost than say in areas served by natural gas. Similarly, many of the areas, those situations, the areas served by natural gas and GMP have by and large lower energy burden than the communities that are not. So in terms of using energy burden as a metric for equity, I would just consider going forward, taking a hard at per capita and equal solutions versus equitable solutions. Thank you.
So does anybody want to respond to that?
Just thank you, Paul, for that comment. I think that, we've had these long-standing metrics for Efficiency Vermont since its creation in 2000 for, in their spending, they track spending. And I think we're all getting an elevated understanding of these issues. And as we, update going forward, I think it's a very good point. And are we really driving the outcome that we're hoping to get with that metric? And I think it's really fair, and I'm really glad you raised it. And it's part of it's part of what we need to consider and how we consider it. And so as we go forward in policy, what I'm hearing is that we need to reevaluate things like this, like that metric, for kind of this broader understanding of equity that we're all gaining.
Thanks, TJ. Do we have any more questions? Philip?
Yes. Ben asked a question in the chat and also has raised his hand. So go ahead. You can unmute yourself, Ben.
Thanks. Realized I could actually just speak up, so decided to do that instead. So this is something that Sarah raised. It's something that I think everyone who works on this issue in the building space is very aware of, but the split incentive issue, I'd love to hear sort of how much progress it feels like is being made on that. And just to put a finer point on one of the things that she said, I'd been looking at some numbers related to demographics and renters over the spring as I was looking at community renewables and solar, and I think it's 75 or 80 now, 80% in that ballpark. Black Vermonters are renters. White Vermonters is more like 1 in 4 than 3 in 4, and other BIPOC Vermonters are also renters at a higher rate. So it's something we've all known we've needed to tackle for a long time. We've made attempts, but really getting that right as we're actually trying to get to net zero feels really critical for a lot of people not being at the very, very end of the line, and getting these services in like 2040 as we're trying to solve the stickiest part of the problem. So from an equity standpoint, that feels essential. So we'd love to hear anything that folks are thinking about that.
So thanks, Ben, for that point. Does anybody have any response?
I think I'm going to let Dave Westman raise his hand, I assume, in response. I think that's a good one for program administrators to provide some input if there's anything that they've been seeing and doing. That'd be great.
Actually, I was going to jump in after Ben with the in response to Paul's question, but I agree with Ben, and his question is definitely spot on. We get that question from the commission pretty regularly, and I know that Efficiency Vermont is always looking at ways to improve our renter assistance programs, and as well creating opportunities for customers who may not be participating in the OEO program, but still have very high energy loads and cannot afford new appliances to do direct replacement programs. So we completely agree with Ben's assessment that renters remain a very challenging topic, and we want to provide more services to them because they are often the ones paying those electricity bills for units that their landlords are essentially providing for them, like refrigerators and water heaters and the like. And so we are rolling out additional programs as we can to provide the deeper discounts, if not outright purchasing, for renters in the form of renter assistance, as well as programs that are targeting the landlords so that they can provide their renters with more efficient equipment. And so I largely completely agree with what Ben said.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. I'll let you mention your other comment, but something that just struck me as you were talking too is I think the new the program that that VHFA is trying to develop with the ARPA funding on the to the meter financing is another avenue to try and that may be able to be a service for renters, and essentially that they wouldn't have to take out their own personal loan. Instead, it would be a loan to the meter, where they could make some investments, but efficiency investments, and the meter would then be paying that back over time, and they wouldn't be kind of tied to the house, like it would stay with the house. Kind of like a new take on the PACE, but much less complicated. And so, Ben, I think it's a great point, and I hope we can get to some more discussion on that with breakouts. And I'll just, Dave, I know you raised your hand for something else, so I'll turn it to you, and then I think we're going to need to start to move on after that.
Thank you. Just trying to click the unmute button. Yeah, I wanted to respond to Paul Zabrisky's comment, which I find incredibly interesting and filled with possibilities, frankly, because on the electric side of the portfolio, where we focus our electric efficiency services, that is largely based on a calculation called total resource benefits. So it's not a spending metric by county. It's a benefits by county, and those benefits, so meaning energy saved, dollars saved, total benefits received by Vermonters is in proportion to the population. I really am intrigued by this idea of for the thermal side of the portfolio to have that less about the, we have certainly looked at geographic distribution of total energy burden. In fact, we have that by county. So that's a very interesting idea. And I just wanted to sort of clarify that the only metric that's based on spending is the low income spending. That's tracked for low income customers, but the equity, the distribution is based on total benefits received. It's a minor point, but just wanted to make that.
Thanks. Any other questions or comments before we move on? Okay, so I think we're at the point where we're going to break, and we will next.
Not quite yet.
Oh,
So,
okay.
yeah, thanks, Cindy. The next, we're going to turn. We have a couple, just a few minutes before our break here, so folks hold tight. I mentioned Dave Farnsworth and Christine Donovan are co-hosting today. You've heard a lot from me talking, but the cross-sector mitigation has proposed some draft policy recommendations and considerations, and Dave is going to present those just to give folks a grounding on what's been presented so far.
Thanks, TJ. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, thanks.
Great, thanks. Hello, everybody. It's nice to be here. Thanks to Christine Donovan for her help on the cross-sector mitigation committee as well, and for the department. You guys do excellent work. I really appreciate your expertise. It's really a great opportunity here. Today is a really good opportunity also for the work we've been doing on the cross-sector mitigation committee, because we have policymakers on the line today. We have program managers, business representatives, and others. And so it's a great opportunity to get your thoughts, let you kick the tires on some of the things that we are thinking about. So I'm looking forward to you all weighing in, and please weigh in if I'm not getting things quite clear. As TJ noted, Vermont buildings produce significant greenhouse gas effects. Most of Vermont's buildings are old. They're older than 1975, and about a quarter of them were built before 1939. So a large partly of this discussion just about modernizing buildings from a thermal perspective. Sarah Phillips made very clear points about many Vermonters being energy burdened, equity burdened. In other words, they pay a large proportion of their incomes for the housing and heating that all of us enjoy. It's my understanding over 90,000 Vermonters pay more than a third of their income to maintain their homes. And there are over 40,000 Vermonters that spend in excess of 50% of their income in their homes. So greenhouse gas reduction solutions that we've been thinking about in the building sector really need to avoid and minimize any adverse effects on these communities and make sure that they support all Vermonters, especially those in these tight situations. So we're at the point in our work on the cross-sector mitigation committee where we've come up with some recommendations. They should be thought of as draft recommendations. And we're at a point where we're handing these off to the consultants that the state has hired, Cadmus, and the Vermont Shop Energy Futures Group, Richard Fazy and Chris Neme's organization, to give us a better sense of the effectiveness of those. But what I'd like to do is just run really quickly down through these and just describe them for you all. The first is weatherization at scale. And there's a large group working on this topic. It's not like Vermont doesn't know how to do weatherization. We've done this for years. The point is to bring it to scale. We have 260 plus homes in the state, buildings in the state, and we've weatherized, TJ said about 30,000 of them, so 10, 12% of them. So we have a lot of work to do. And what this group is doing is really valuable. First, very broadly, they're looking at funding sources and at financing issues. That's one thing that Richard Fazy is doing. What's the current funding? What sort of incremental fund do they need to build up to meet Global Warming Solutions Act goals? There's also a quick look at federal funding. The current federal funding may be part of this, but the bipartisan bill, while it's looking at transportation, electrification, it's not looking at buildings. However, the budget reconciliation bill, which is a little farther out and more unsure, is federal funding that potentially could have a lot of revenue to provide to the state to do these sorts of things. So that's a broad look that they're taking on funding. A more targeted one is something that's been mentioned a couple times here. It's called tariff on bill financing. It's a focused approach. It's designed to overcome upfront costs. And as was mentioned, it's tied not to any individual renter has to go out and get a loan, but to the account itself. And that the financing for efficiency improvements would be keyed to that meter itself. Third thing they're doing is looking at workforce development. Building things to scale obviously means bringing Vermonters along, and so they can deliver these services. The legislature has funded recently a study on developing building science curriculum, and there's more work being done there. The fourth thing they're doing that I think is worth considering as part of weatherization at scale is that they're looking at energy savings counseling. Broadly, we think of education, but this is really somebody can get on the phone and call up and say, look, this is my income. This is what I'm thinking doing. What sort of things can I do to make investments to improve the efficiency of my housing? I understand that the CAP agencies are hiring the 5 different locations in state they're hiring, or they're budgeting to hire folks to provide a counselor in each of those spots. So the idea is to help everybody participate and understand the things they need to do to benefit from these programs. So that's weatherization at scale. The next thing is something called a clean heat standard. We're recommending this. It's a performance standard. It applies to providers of fossil fuel. It would require them to deliver a gradually increasing percentage of low emissions heating services to Vermont customers, underlying heating services. The goal here is to drive our fuel use to carbon-free or lower carbon intensive fuels like electricity, biodiesel, biogas, for space heating, water heating, and transportation. This approach would give consumers, it would give businesses involved in this, in these services, it gives them choices on how to comply, and it builds a performance standard that goes out over years and basically tightens, ratchets down to reduce the carbon intensity of the fuels that are being provided to Vermonters to heat their homes, heat water. We think that this is an equitable way of lowering emissions for heating fuels, and it provides the opportunity to reduce upfront costs for people. The third point here is a rental efficiency ordinance. A rental property efficiency standard's been explored by a number of municipalities around the country. Boulder, Colorado is one that has a pretty interesting program. The idea is to help rental property owners, landlords, meet minimum efficiency standards through education and providing them financial support. And somebody just mentioned that split incentive. How do you get renters to make efficiency investments? Well, as we know, renters are probably not in the best position to make them. The question might be, how do you get landlords to make these efficiency investments? And you provide them education and financial support. And this is intended to overcome that split incentive associated with rental property. Of course, the more efficient and comfortable the property becomes, the more valuable it becomes, and landlords would be inclined to raise the value of those properties, and that would have a negative effect on renters. So perhaps a program could be designed to make sure that rents don't get raised for a certain period of time. Would it be 3 years, 5 years, based on the amount of support that landlords would get from these programs? There are lots of complementary policies, just a final observation here, that go along with these three proposals. The trend on the US grid has become, is a positive one. That is the carbon content of electricity that's being provided has continually gone down in the lower 48 states since 1990, and it continues to do so. Connecting some of these things to renewables, as was mentioned today, is also a good idea. Demand management is really important. If you're going to get electricity to do some of these things, making sure that you can control a water heater and heat that water at the lowest cost time, the lowest emissions time on the web, same with a vehicle. And I've already mentioned workforce development. So I think that's it. Thanks for your attention, and I look forward to our discussion.
Thanks, Dave. And I want to move us along because we're getting a little bit tight for time. TJ, I think you had some comments before we get to a break and then move on to breakout sessions. So if you could make
thanks. And this will be, thank you, Cindy. This will be really brief. I just wanted to frame up the breakouts really quickly. You can go to the next slide. So just a reminder as to why we're here, really to get input, and I'll just go briefly, but understanding how we should consider and balance the trade-offs among criteria when assessing policy options. I think Chase's question early on hit the nail on the head when I was presenting one thing from a customer perspective, but in his question was really from a societal perspective, and so where should we balance that, and how should we look at that and consider both or any of those perspectives as we go forward, and then comments on strategies, policies that are needed to achieve our targets, the ones that Dave just presented or others. Next slide. And when we talk about this customer and societal test, there's other nuance to that. And what perspective should we be looking at? Is it that societal perspective? Do we just care about Vermont borders? Are we caring about just the public and program investment? And then those other pieces, carbon is actually easier to quantify and value now, or there's a lot of information on it, more so than, for instance, the health impacts of weatherization. And so how do we value those that aren't easy to quantify? The risk of acting or the risk of not acting. What happens if we don't do anything? What happens if we do something and it's the wrong direction? We support heat pumps, we choose a winner. I shouldn't have named a technology. We choose a winner, and it turns out we that is, 10 years down the road, we find out that that really wasn't the winner. How do we adapt and make those decisions in the face of that uncertainty? And then time value. A lot of these policies, especially when we talk about program public investment, they're upfront costs for a long-term payback. And a lot of that can be cost effective, but it can have an impact on affordability, for example. And so I really ran through these quickly. This is just high level questions, but I wanted to keep these types of questions in your mind as you go through and discuss in each sector and in the breakouts. And with that, I think we'll turn it to, I think either
Actually,
Claire.
TJ,
I'm
let's
sorry.
turn to Claire or Philip to explain the mechanics of the breakouts.
Right.
Great, thanks. So, perfect, thanks, Kelly. So we have 3 breakout rooms. The themes are listed on the slide here and were also circulated on the agenda. I just opened all of them and we're allowing everyone to select the breakout they would like to join so it best aligns with your expertise or interests. Hopefully, since I just opened the breakout rooms, you either got a pop-up notification or in the bottom of your screen now see a little button next to the reactions with the breakout rooms, and through that you should.
So excuse me, Claire, but let me just interject that you may not see it unless you hover down at the bottom of your screen, and then you may see something that says breakout rooms.
Great, and it looks like folks are already heading there, but it is our hope that you'll join the breakout room before we are moved to our 10-minute break, just so we have that time to sort out any technical difficulties. And to Cindy's point, hopefully everyone can either hover and see that option and join a breakout room directly. We learned that in some older versions of Zoom, that might not be possible. So if that's the case for you, hold tight and stay in the main room, and I have the ability to assign you to the room of your choice. So we can work through that, either if you want to raise your hand and then let me know what breakout room you'd like to join, or put it in the chat. Philip and I can both help manage that process. So again, those breakout rooms should be open through clicking that breakout room button. You should be able to join one. If you can't, stay here and we will help you join the room of your choice. And once you're there, feel free to take a 10-minute break and we will return at 11:10, I believe is the goal. And if I forgot anything, yeah, please jump in.